It is Tuesday, 26th of January 2021, if you can believe it, and today is a clinic visit day for me. So I thought I would bring you guys along with me and talk a little bit about my gene therapy trial experience so far. For those of you who don't recognise me or know me, my name is Luke. I'm 26 years old. I have severe hemophilia B, or do I? And last year, on February 11th, I enrolled and was dosed with gene therapy. That's about it for now. Let's go. Today I'm going to be taking back leftover immunosuppression. I want it out the house. Not taking up any space, and I'm glad to be rid of it. Sharp spins. Despite going on to gene therapy, I had to keep a couple of these around because I had to do bloods from home during the middle of the pandemic. And then lastly, and probably most importantly these days, packing plenty of hand sanitizer. So I just moved into my new flat today, finally living with someone, my good friend Lewis. I'll show you Lewis in a second. Lewis,
yeah.
Question. What do you think gene therapy means for me?
No hemo.
So for EHAD 2021, which will of course be virtual this year, I was asked to talk about my experience of a hemophilia B gene therapy trial. Goes without saying, it's been quite an experience given everything that's been going on in the world. I figured, as we all can't travel right now, those of you across the world who may be attending EHAD 2021 online could maybe get a brief look of London and what my journey to my hospital looks like. And this is what I do every time I go for my blood tests at the moment. I'm currently going in once every 2 weeks, and last year things were a lot more intense. For the first few months I was going in 3 times a week for bloods, then down to twice a week for probably about another 4 or 5 months, and then down to once a week for 2 months, and now I'm down to once every 2 weeks, which feels great. We are currently in another national lockdown in England, so going for my hospital visits is the only time I really get out the house. So every cloud.
Shortly be arriving at Deptford.
So obviously it's pretty hard for me to sum up my entire gene therapy trial experience over the past year in a mere 15 minutes, but I'm going to try and touch upon some of the key things that stand out to me. So one interesting thing that I think is worth mentioning is it's nice being able to just leave the house and not have to think about whether I've taken my factor or not, or if my coverage is going to be high enough for the day ahead. On the flip side, yesterday when I was moving into my new flat, 1 second. Anyway, I got sidetracked. When I was moving yesterday, I had to move a lot of my stuff up and down many flights of stairs, and my ankle was on fire. I have pre-existing joint damage. I have arthritis in my left ankle joint pretty severely, and it was giving me problems. The nice thing is I can be pretty confident, having gone through gene therapy of my levels at the current level they are, that it isn't a bleed. But it's still interesting to note that despite having gene therapy, a lot of people, myself included, are still going to have, you know, the scars of a life lived with haemophilia. The think one of the other things that's worth mentioning whilst I'm on a train trekking to the other side of London for my appointment is that I was fully aware of how much of a commitment the gene therapy trial was going to require, and it's been made even more complicated and intense due to the coronavirus pandemic. But even with all that said, it has still been a lot more work and effort than I even anticipated. I think it's one of those things where you can try and prepare yourself for it.
Shortly be arriving at London Bridge. The doors will open automatically at the next station.
I think it's one of those things that no matter how much you try and prepare for it, you're never really going to know what it's like to experience it until you're actually experiencing it, right? Anyway, this is my stop. I got to get off, jump on the Northern Line, and I should be at the Hemophilia Centre soon. So here we are. This is the room it all happened in. This is the room at my haemophilia centre where I was dosed with gene therapy, and the room that I've sat in multiple times throughout the last year to have bloods taken, observations done, you name it. I feel like I've pretty much lived in this room for a large part of the year. I do remember hearing a talk from one of my professors a couple of years ago. They said it almost felt like the Haemophilia Centre became a second home for people going through the gene therapy trial, and I can definitely confirm that's how it felt throughout the past year. I've spent many hours here. But they're all lovely, and they're a great team, and I couldn't have asked for a better team to be taking care of me throughout this trial, especially during such a difficult time for everyone working within the NHS. One important thing to note is that I was actually relocated nearby to the hospital for a large amount of time last year during the height of the pandemic, and this was so that I was close by for all of my appointments and didn't have to risk travelling through London whilst being on high doses of immunosuppression as part of the trial. So it's safe to say that COVID has massively influenced my experience of the gene therapy trial, and whilst everyone's experience of a gene therapy trial is going to be very subjective, I just want to preface and say that going through it during the COVID pandemic has made it, well, an experience to say the least. It's the man himself. John, of all the days that I'm recording my EHAD presentation, where I'm talking about all the lovely work that my trial team have done, in particular this man, he's not the one who takes my bloods today. Do you mind being in my EHAD presentation?
I don't mind at all.
Okay, this is verbal confirmation. John, what's it been like looking after me throughout the past year, the clinical trial, the pandemic? I've told him it's crazy.
Yeah.
How's it been?
Of course, it's been crazy. I mean, there's a lot of, since we are still doing trials, so we have a lot of unknowns, things that are not expected coming out. Yeah, like one best example is your immunosuppression thing. Yeah, because
how bad did I look on immunosuppression, Jun? Be honest. You don't have to be nice. Did I look bad on immunosuppression?
I agree with you. I agree with you.
Jun's usually too kind. When I came in on immunosuppression, I looked fat, barely any sleep, like a zombie, and Jun didn't say a word. He was way too kind.
Trying to be nice.
But obviously, just to make me feel better, would you say I've been a good patient?
You are, Luke. Yeah. Very compliant.
Yes.
So you always do as what we say or what we ask you to do. We appreciate that.
I appreciate you, Jun, and I appreciate all of the team here who, as I've said earlier, have just been amazing throughout the trial, but in particular, this man, Jun. Well, during the height of the pandemic, Jun was the only other human being I really saw in person. So, big part of my life over the last year. Of course, Jun was the man himself who actually gave me the gene therapy. So, pretty crazy to think. Anyway, I hope you don't mind being in my EHAD presentation, but I figured as everyone's going to be sat at a desk, I would take them for a little trip through London, to my clinic visit instead of me
Cool.
just sat at my desk talking.
Exactly.
Good idea, bad idea?
Good idea. Of course. Yeah.
Anyway, thanks, Jun.
No
Top
worries.
man. Always a pleasure to see the Royal Free team. Now to head back home.
Customer safety announcements. For your safety and the safety.
Please wear a face covering.
Platform 4 for 12, 18.
I just wanted to pick up on something Jun mentioned about unexpected and unknowns and unforeseen events during the trial. This was something that I experienced. Obviously, I read the initial clinical trial protocol, patient information sheets, thoroughly, repeated amounts of times, and had endless conversations with the team involved in the trial. And whilst that set out a very clear plan of how things would run, a lot of the trial required being quite flexible and adapting to different results and situations as we went along. So initially the expectation was that I would start on immunosuppression and I would be on it for several months and gradually be tapered off. That happened as planned, and I came off immunosuppression in August, and things were looking fine for the most part, and then towards the end of that month there was a slight hint of elevation in the liver enzymes, and so the decision was made to recommence immunosuppression. This was something I really didn't want to have to do, as my experience being on the immunosuppression was pretty horrid. The side effects are rough, and whilst you read them on paper and you know what they're going to be, until you're actually experiencing them, I don't think you can really prepare yourself for it. Whilst I'd lived with hemophilia for nearly 26 years prior to starting gene therapy, I never really considered myself ill. I had this condition that would affect me physically in many ways, but I wouldn't compare it to feeling ill or having an illness, if you like. So that was a new experience for me. And I think when it comes to the immunosuppression, in regards to gene therapy trials and treatment, this is something we need to really think about as a community, because at least for the younger generation and the generations coming through, people who live with haemophilia aren't really accustomed to feeling sick or ill, which are the side effects you get from being on immunosuppression. So we need to think about how this can be best designed and implemented to have the minimum impact on people's well-being and quality of life. And I think we also need to take into account what is the acceptability of going on to immunosuppression for the community. Speaking from my own experience personally, I was not prepared for the effects of the immunosuppression to be as brutal as they were. I mean, they really did knock me for six. Home sweet home. So the immunosuppression element of the clinical trial is something I could talk about a lot, because it represents such a significant part of my trial experience. However, I realised time is limited, so I wanted to move on to another important aspect of taking part in a gene therapy clinical trial, and that is expectations. So when it comes to expectations, I think this is a really important issue surrounding gene therapy, more specifically so when it comes to a clinical trial, as we all know that when it comes to clinical trials, it's a investigatory trial that tries to find if the treatment is safe and if the treatment works. And unexpected things can happen within clinical trials. It's a lot to think about, and I will take you through my decision-making process and how I formed my expectations. But first, I need to have a cup of tea, because I'm very tired and I'm British and I need tea. So, let's talk about expectations, and more specifically my expectations when it came to enrolling and taking part in a gene therapy clinical trial. There's lots of things that change throughout the trial, and my expectations have been something that I think have constantly evolved, but I don't want to sound like a pessimist. I very much did go into the trial with low expectations. One, because I thought that was quite important to mentally prepare yourself for the fact that this is a clinical trial, it's an unproven treatment, and there's no guarantees here. And then on the other side, I didn't want to get ahead of myself and get very excited and start throwing out expectations that sounded really exciting headlines that I think the layman would latch on to. In my mind, I prepared myself for the worst possible case scenario of gene therapy being administered and then massive immune response, it wearing off, and me being back to where I started. Obviously, there's all the long-term unknowns that we're yet to know about, but in terms of my immediate worst case scenario, it was the gene therapy doesn't work. That would be a bit of a bummer, to say the least. In the back of my mind, I always kept there that even if things didn't work out, being part of a clinical trial and contributing to the research is only going to bring us nearer to the end goal of hopefully finding a cure for hemophilia. I think so much in your ordinary day-to-day life will shape and form what your expectations are for gene therapy, and everyone has a variety of different reasons for taking part in a gene therapy trial, and I don't think it's, at least in my case, it was not one set reason on why I wanted to take part. It was a multitude of reasons. And from conversations I've had with others in the community, I think that is pretty common across the board. I don't think people have one set reason why they go into a gene therapy trial. And when it comes to expectations, I think everyone's going to have a variation there. I think the clinical teams will play a massively important role in terms of managing people's expectations. And that starts from early conversations about gene therapy trials going on at the individual centre, right the way up into the consenting process, and then expectations being managed and talked about as the trial progresses. Within the last year, so much has changed within my life in regards to my medical condition and my haemophilia, and I've had a lot going on in my life personally, as everyone has around the world with everything that's going on. Constantly re-evaluating and seeing where I was at throughout the year and how my expectations month to month sort of changed was really interesting for me. Another thing I wanted to say about expectations is they form a very important part of the preparation process going into a trial, and I considered myself very well prepared, mentally, in my personal life, getting everything where it needed to be. The trial still broke past my expectations in so many ways. When it came to the immunosuppression, I thought I'd set my expectations and prepared myself really well. It still knocked me for 6 as time went on. In terms of the number of visits required, this ended up being more than originally planned in the initial protocol, and I was told about these changes every step of the way, and whilst I thought I'd set my expectations and I was prepared for this, it still went further than that. And it was a lot more intense than I had thought it was going to be. And I thought it was going to be intense to begin with, so that's saying something. I hope you've enjoyed this sort of brief insight into my gene therapy clinical trial experience so far. I know I'm quite limited by time, and there are so many different elements of this trial that I could talk about. If you have questions for the Q&A session afterwards, please fire them at me or reach out to me online at some point. Finally, thank you for coming with me through London to my clinic appointment, and it's nice to have company. I hope seeing London briefly through your laptop screens was enjoyable and felt like travelling, which is something we can't do right now. And thank you for listening. Cheers.